A barefoot girl whispers a prayer under a flickering streetlight. Not for toys, not for food, but for a family. Miles away, a millionaire hears her words and feels a guilt he buried long ago crack wide open. What connects them isn't fate. It's a man behind bars, a promise forgotten, and a system that wants them silenced. As powerful forces push back, one child's hope may expose the truth America tries to bury. She prayed for someone better. What she got was Big Shaq, ready to fight. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It started with a prayer no one was supposed to hear. The street was quiet in the way only southern neighborhoods could be. Gentle breezes rustling through pecan trees, porch lights dimmed, and the occasional creak of wooden steps settling into night. On the cracked sidewalk near the corner of Beaufort Street, a single streetlight flickered like it was remembering something. Beneath it, a girl no older than 9, barefoot and bundled in a faded purple hoodie 2 sizes too big, knelt with her hands clasped in front of her. She wasn't crying loudly. Her tears weren't wild or panicked. They rolled steady like they had practice. She whispered to the sky, her voice too soft for most to hear, but someone did. Across the street, inside a black Escalade with tinted windows, Shaquille O'Neal sat reclined in the driver's seat, one hand resting on the steering wheel, the other holding a lukewarm protein shake he hadn't touched since pulling up. He hadn't planned on stopping here. He wasn't even sure what drew him to this block. He'd just finished speaking at a community event 3 miles away, all cameras and forced smiles and shaking hands with mayors who only showed up when there were flashbulbs. Now in this unlit part of Savannah, he wasn't Big Shaq. He was just tired. But when he saw the girl kneel under that sputtering light, something made him stay. She didn't notice the SUV. She didn't notice anything beyond that circle of cracked concrete and moonlight. Her small voice carried words that hit Shaq with the force of a free throw to the chest. "Dear God," she said, "I don't want toys this year. I don't want candy. I don't even want that sparkly backpack Mama said we can't afford. I just want my family to come back. All of it. I want a daddy like other girls got. I want a family that stays. Please, please, just send somebody. Send anybody. I don't want to be this alone." The way she said this alone, not just alone but this alone, made something deep in Shaq shift. He had heard thousands of stories, had donated millions, cut ribbons at community centers, hugged kids, signed checks. But this wasn't part of a campaign. This was real, raw, and heard in a place he had no business being at that hour. He leaned back in his seat, unsure if he should get out, unsure if he had the right. But something about the girl, her stillness, her certainty, held him there. There was something sacred in it. She was not begging. She was not dramatic. She was speaking to God like he was her last option. Maybe he was. As she rose, she wiped her eyes with the edge of her sleeve and walked slowly back up the block toward a worn-out duplex with half the porch railing missing. She didn't look back once. She didn't expect anyone to answer that prayer. Shaq watched her go, saw the door creak open, a silhouette of an older woman waiting inside with a lamp in one hand and weariness in her shoulders. The girl stepped in, and the door closed behind her. Shaq remained parked, engine off, windows fogged slightly from his breath. He remembered something Lucille, his mother, used to say when he was small and loud and constantly getting into trouble in Newark. God puts you in the path of what you can fix. The rest ain't yours to touch. But this felt like it was his to touch. That prayer, that girl. There was a reason he'd heard it. He believed in that kind of thing more than he admitted. Not the flashy miracles, the quiet ones, the kind whispered under broken lights, where no one was supposed to be listening. He opened the glove box and pulled out an old notepad where he scribbled names and ideas for his next community campaign. On the top of a clean page he wrote, "Girl under the streetlight. Find her name." Then he turned the key, started the engine, and rolled silently down the block. He didn't know it yet, but this night wasn't the end of his long day. It was the beginning of something that would redefine everything he thought he knew about family, forgiveness, and the weight of prayers meant for someone else. Back inside the duplex, the girl Journée peeled off her hoodie and laid it carefully over the edge of the couch. She didn't tell her grandmother about the prayer, didn't say she'd been outside. She just nodded when asked if she brushed her teeth and climbed into bed under a quilt sewn with patches from old choir robes and church bake sale aprons. She clutched a photo under her pillow, a man with kind eyes and tired shoulders. Her father, missing, gone, forgotten by everyone but her. The prayer had been said. As far as she knew, that was all she could do. But across the city, a man who could move mountains with money and silence with presence had heard it, and Big Shaq wasn't the kind to walk away from a voice like that. Not anymore. Because sometimes the world doesn't need more celebrities. It needs someone who listens when no one else is supposed to. Fame makes you loud. Loneliness makes you silent. The gates to Shaquille O'Neal's estate in Atlanta opened slowly, as if resisting the return of a man who had no business feeling as hollow as he did. The long driveway curled through manicured trees and freshly cut hedges, winding toward a house that looked more like a museum than a home. Tall columns, glass walls, polished marble floors inside that gleamed under recessed lighting. But tonight, as he stepped inside, Shaq felt like he was walking into a cavern where echoes lived longer than memories. He closed the door behind him, the click louder than it needed to be. The silence greeted him first. Then came the weight. Not physical, he had long conquered that, but emotional, spiritual, the kind of weight that no gym could bench press away, the kind of silence that makes your own thoughts too loud. He dropped his keys into the bowl near the door, the sound sharp in the open space. The living room lights flickered on automatically, illuminating shelves full of awards, magazine covers, framed photos with presidents, and laughter frozen in glossy perfection. But none of it felt alive. Not anymore. Shaq walked past the kitchen, ignored the untouched food prepped by a private chef earlier that day. He made his way into the den, where a leather armchair waited beside a fireplace that hadn't been lit in years. He sank into the chair and leaned back, staring at nothing. That girl's voice, that whispered prayer, still lingered in his ears, like a haunting melody you don't want to forget even though it hurts. He rubbed his face, the roughness of his palms scraping against the stubble on his jaw. He had once thought success would erase every ghost, that if he rose high enough, rich enough, big enough, he could outrun the past. But the past had a long reach, and tonight, it grabbed him by the collar and dragged him backward. In his mind, the years folded like paper. He was back in a hospital room in Newark, holding the hand of Terrence T-Mac McCullers, his childhood friend who was fading fast from cancer. They had grown up in the same rough neighborhood, played ball on cracked courts with chain nets, shared peanut butter sandwiches when their fridges were empty. T-Mac had been the first to believe in Shaq before the world even knew his name. And before dying, T-Mac had made one last request. "Look after my little brother, man. Don't let the streets get him." Shaq had said yes, but life happened. Fame exploded. Games, endorsements, interviews, appearances. The machine didn't stop. He sent money, sure, had his assistant check in a few times, but somewhere along the way, T-Mac's brother, Carter, vanished into the cracks of the system. Juvenile hall, foster homes, eventually prison. The last time Shaq heard about him, Carter had been arrested for a robbery he swore he didn't commit. Shaq never visited, didn't write, didn't ask again. That failure had stayed buried, until now. Until that little girl's prayer scraped it out like a splinter under skin. Her words reminded him of the ones Carter once wrote in a letter Shaq never answered. "I don't want your money. I want someone who gives a damn." Shaq stood up and wandered toward the trophy wall. Dozens of accolades stared back. NBA rings, humanitarian awards, honorary degrees. He had done good things, important things. But tonight they felt hollow, as if each accomplishment came at the cost of someone he'd left behind. He touched one frame, his humanitarian award from the Atlanta Children's Alliance, and remembered how empty he'd felt receiving it. Everyone had clapped, cameras had flashed, but he'd seen one black boy near the back of the crowd staring at him with something like resentment, like he knew something the others didn't. The truth was, Shaq had always given his best to the world, but he hadn't always given it to the people who needed it most, not when it counted. He pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen. He scrolled through recent photos, charity events, brand shoots, sponsored posts. Then he opened the Notes app, the one where he had typed just hours ago. "Girl under the streetlight. Find her name." Her face wasn't in his gallery, but it was sharper in his mind than any photo could capture. Something inside him stirred an ache to do more than throw money at a problem. A hunger to show up for once, not with a mic, not for applause, but for real. He tapped into an old folder of contacts and found the number of Eloise Carrington, a retired social worker he'd once collaborated with during a youth justice campaign. She had retired 5 years ago, but if anyone knew how to find a child's name from a neighborhood like that, it was her. He typed a message, hesitated, then hit send. As he waited, he drifted toward the sunken media room, where the walls played a silent reel of his own legend. Game footage looped on a projector, highlight dunks, crowd roars, teammates cheering. Shaq watched himself in slow motion, slamming balls through hoops like a god among men. But in that moment, all he saw was a man who had lost the thread. The silence in the house thickened, not cold, but reflective, like it was asking him, "What now?" Shaq walked upstairs, passing guest rooms no one stayed in anymore, closets full of designer clothes he didn't wear. He reached his room and pulled open a drawer. Inside was a smaller photo album, one he hadn't touched in years. He flipped through pages of his children when they were young. His mother Lucille laughing in a kitchen. His ex-wife Shawnee smiling beside him on a beach they never went back to. So many chapters written and closed. The phone buzzed. A reply from Eloise. "I'll see what I can find. But if you're serious about this, you'll need more than a name. You'll need heart." Shaq put the phone down and looked out the window. Below, the city shimmered under the night sky. Beautiful, brutal, full of stories. One of them belonged to a girl who believed enough to pray into an empty night. He wondered who else was praying. Who else he had missed. The estate remained still, but inside him, something had shifted. The cameras had long stopped rolling. The applause had faded. But what the world never saw, what they weren't meant to, was that even giants can feel small when confronted with truth. And somewhere, miles away, a little girl was still asleep beneath a tattered quilt, believing her voice had gone unheard. She had no idea the man who once towered over stadiums was now walking through his halls like a man trying to remember what it meant to matter beyond headlines. What the world loved about Big Shaq was his size. What they didn't see was his silence. But silence has a way of waking up when prayers land exactly where they weren't supposed to. Before she was a prayer, she was just a kid drawing angels on concrete. Journey Whitaker didn't know her neighborhood was considered a problem zone. She didn't know city council maps had red lines drawn around her street, or that realtors called it economically disadvantaged when trying to steer buyers elsewhere. All she knew was the sidewalk cracked in ways that looked like puzzle pieces. The corner store smelled like burnt grease and dust, and if you stepped on the wrong porch step at her grandma's duplex, the whole railing shuddered like it might fall apart. It was late afternoon, sunlight pooling gold over the rooftops, heat rising in soft ripples from the pavement. Journey sat cross-legged in front of a boarded-up laundromat, a bucket of chalk beside her, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated. She had drawn an angel with big wild hair and wings that didn't match. One wing drooped lower, as if it were tired, which made sense to her. In her drawings, angels weren't perfect. They had dirt on their feet and sometimes tears on their cheeks. The one she was working on now looked like her daddy, or at least how she remembered him from the photo under her pillow. She didn't know the man's name parked across the street in a black SUV. Didn't know he'd been driving this block slowly every other day since he heard her prayer beneath the streetlight. She definitely didn't know that the chalk she was gripping in her small fingers would soon connect her story to his in a way neither of them expected. Shaq leaned forward behind the wheel, watching her through the windshield. He hadn't planned to get out. He'd told himself he was just passing by again, just observing. But seeing her now in the light of day, alive and expressive, and fully human, she wasn't just a voice anymore. She was a child full of color, in a world that kept trying to fade her into gray. He was struck by how alone she looked. Even among other people, a few boys rode past on bikes, loud and teasing. A man walked out of the convenience store, counting change. An older woman argued with someone on speakerphone, but none of it touched Journey. She existed in her own bubble of chalk dust and hope. What made Shaq sit up straighter was the next thing she did. She picked out a piece of bright yellow chalk, stood up, and carefully wrote her full name beneath the angel's feet. Journey Whitaker. All caps, firm strokes. As if she needed the world to know who she was. Not guess, not forget, just know. Shaq blinked. That was the name, the key he needed. He quickly grabbed his phone and typed it out in his notes. He didn't move yet, he just watched. From across the street he could see how her eyes darted toward the chalk name, as if making sure it didn't blow away with the breeze. She dusted her hands on her jeans, packed up her bucket, and walked down the block, pausing only once to look at the name she'd left behind. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just left it there like a message meant for someone who might never see it. But someone had. Someone was watching. Back at the duplex, Miss Odessa was sitting on the porch with a damp towel around her neck, trying to beat the Georgia heat with a fan that only clicked when it should have hummed. She saw Journey returning and called her inside. Dinner was ready. They were having butter beans and rice again. Inside their tiny kitchen, steam fogged the windows as pots clanked and water ran. Miss Odessa moved slow these days, hips stiff, knees stiff, her voice still strong but lined with years of disappointment and warnings the world didn't always listen to. She asked about school, about whether the teacher sent home another permission slip, and whether the counselor had been acting funny again. Journey said no to all of it. She didn't talk much about school, not since that day she was sent home for starting trouble, just for asking why the black kids always had to use the broken books. Journey wasn't one to pick fights, but she also wasn't one to swallow unfairness. Miss Odessa said that came from her daddy. Said he used to walk out of class too. Head held high, fists clenched but unused. He was quiet until someone pushed too hard. Then he made noise with his mind, not his hands. People called that defiance. Miss Odessa called it dignity. After dinner, Journey sat on the edge of the couch flipping through an old church hymnal, pretending to read. Her mind, though, was still outside, by the chalk name and the angel with one lazy wing. She wondered if the name would still be there tomorrow, if the rain would come, if anyone would care. Across town, Shaq sat in his media room again. This time, he wasn't watching game highlights. He was pulling up public school databases, youth center archives, and local community outreach programs. It took some digging, but he found her. 3rd grade, listed under guardianship of Odessa Whitaker. No father on file. No listed emergency contact besides the grandmother. No medical alerts. But one note stood out. Recommended for advanced placement based on reading comprehension, emotional intelligence, and critical thinking. Declined due to zoning restrictions. Shaq sat back. The words felt like a slap. Declined due to zoning. A brilliant child being held back because of a line someone drew on a city map. That kind of thing didn't make headlines. It didn't trend, but it shaped lives all the same. He closed the screen and rubbed his temples. This wasn't just about helping. This wasn't charity. This was accountability. He was part of a system that had elevated him, while burying others like her father, like Carter, like too many others. And now he was looking directly at one more casualty in the making, with chalk on her fingers and an angel on her mind. The next day he returned to that block, not in a tinted SUV, but walking. Hoodie pulled low, sunglasses on, dressed down in old sneakers, no one would expect from a man who once made shoe deals worth millions. He approached the spot cautiously. The angel was still there, slightly faded, the yellow name cracked through the middle by a sneaker tread. He crouched down slowly, like he was at a gravesite, and stared at the name. Journey Whitaker. He didn't touch the chalk, didn't redraw it. He just stood, committing every line to memory. Then he walked into the convenience store, bought a water, and casually asked the clerk, "That little girl out here yesterday, she come by often?" The clerk looked up, unimpressed. "Journey? Yeah, lives down the block. Real quiet kid. Draws all over the sidewalk. Sweet though. Her grandma got a bad hip. They stay to themselves mostly." Shaq nodded, thanked him, and left. His mind was already turning. The name had opened a door, and what lay behind it wasn't just the story of a girl. It was the shadow of a family lost, a system that had abandoned them, and a responsibility he could no longer ignore. Back home that night, he stared at a blank whiteboard in his office. In bold marker, he wrote 3 names. Journey Whitaker, Jeremiah Whitaker, Terrence T. Mac McCullers. The first was a present, the second a past, the third a debt. The chalk had done what speeches, awards, and applause never could. It had grounded him, reminded him, recalled him. There was no turning back now. He had her name, and with it, a new purpose. In a city full of invisible stories, hers had just been written in yellow chalk, and for the first time someone was reading it. There's a stare that haunts you when you recognize it in someone else. The auditorium smelled like fresh pencil shavings and floor polish, the kind of scent that clung to public school walls and lingered through decades of low funding and high expectations. Folding chairs scraped against the tiles as students filed in, most of them dragging their feet, more interested in the chance to skip class than to hear another guest speaker talk about hard work and perseverance. But when Shaquille O'Neal walked onto the small stage wearing a modest gray sweater, jeans, and a pair of scuffed-up Jordans, the room shifted. Eyes widened, phones were raised, muffled gasps rippled through rows of restless 8th graders. Shaq gave a small nod to the principal, a wiry man named Mr. Keaton, who tried too hard to seem hip with his elbow-patched blazer and Apple Watch. This wasn't the kind of school used to celebrity visits. There were no banners, no morning assembly buzz, just a quiet favor granted by an old friend of a friend who'd slipped Shaq in under the radar. He didn't want attention, he wanted answers. He cleared his throat as the mic squealed slightly, scanning the crowd with practiced calm. His words were simple, stories of his youth, the coaches who saved him from the streets, the choices that pulled him out of trouble. The crowd chuckled at his jokes, nodded at his wisdom, but Shaq wasn't really focused on his speech. His eyes kept returning to the 3rd row, left side, center seat. A girl with honey-brown skin, neat cornrows pulled back with a butterfly clip, and an expression that didn't match her age. Journey Whitaker wasn't smiling like the other kids. She wasn't starstruck. She wasn't even pretending to be impressed. She watched him with quiet stillness, eyes locked, unreadable. Shaq knew those eyes, not just the shape or the color, the stare. It hit him like a gut punch. He had seen it before, years ago, in a courtroom, eyes wide with disbelief. Hurt hardened into defiance, That same quiet intensity that dared anyone to say something false and called it out the moment they did. Jeremiah Whitaker. Shaq had mentored Jeremiah back when the kid was a senior at Carver High. A tall, agile forward with a mid-range jump shot smooth as silk and court vision well beyond his years. But more than that, Jeremiah had grit. He was disciplined, kind, thoughtful, always the first to pick up after practice, always the last to speak when someone else had something to say. Shaq saw himself in Jeremiah, not in talent, but in heart. He'd promised to help guide him through college recruitment, had set up meetings, lined up sponsors, even talked to a scout at Xavier. But Jeremiah never made it past that summer. Shaq still remembered the headline, "Local teen arrested in robbery gone wrong." The details were weak, security footage obscured, testimonies conflicting, no weapon ever found. But the court didn't care. The DA wanted a win. The public wanted another cautionary tale. And just like that, Jeremiah disappeared into the prison system with 25 years tagged to his name. Shaq had felt the guilt, of course, sent legal aid, reached out to his foundation, but nothing stuck, and in time, life moved on. Until now. Staring into Journey's eyes, Shaq's chest tightened. He finished his talk, took a few polite photos with the front row, then nodded to Mr. Keaton and quietly made his way toward the back. But as he passed the side door, a voice stopped him. "She don't talk to just anyone, you know." It was a soft-spoken woman, mid-40s, wearing a school badge clipped to her cardigan. Ms. Traylor, the guidance counselor. She tilted her head toward the third row. "That girl, Journey, sharp as a tack, reads way above grade level, writes like she's 30, but she stays quiet. Been through too much too young. Daddy's not around. Grandma's raising her. You probably caught her on a good day." Shaq tried to keep his voice even. "Her father, what's his name?" The counselor glanced around. "I don't think it's listed. Her file doesn't say. But the girl talks about him sometimes. Says he's not dead. Just locked away from the light. That's how she put it. Like a poet. You ever heard a 9-year-old say something like that?" Shaq nodded slowly, but his mind was elsewhere. Locked away from the light. That was Jeremiah. That had to be. Outside, the sky had shifted to overcast. A soft wind carried dust across the lot as Shaq got into his car and pulled up his phone. It didn't take much to confirm what he already suspected. Jeremiah Whitaker, incarcerated at Ridgeport Correctional Facility. 15 years served. No parole granted. No visitors listed in the past 3 years. Shaq sat there, gripping the steering wheel, pulse racing with something more volatile than adrenaline. It was guilt, but deeper, like a wound he thought had scabbed over that suddenly split back open. He had promised Jeremiah a way out, then he let the world swallow him whole. Now here was his daughter, drawing angels in chalk, whispering prayers into broken streetlights, carrying the eyes of a man the world had forgotten. The next morning, Shaq made a call to Ray Delancey, his longtime lawyer and one of the few people who didn't flinch when he called before 7 a.m. Ray had been instrumental in past cases involving juvenile reform, and knew the prison system too well for someone who'd never been incarcerated. Shaq told her everything. Jeremiah, the girl, the old promises, the new guilt. Ray listened quietly, then said, "If you're serious about this, we don't start with a press release. We start with a visit. Quiet, off the record." By that afternoon, she had a plan in motion. But for Shaq, this wasn't about strategy. It was about a mirror being held up, about seeing himself not in fame or strength or applause, but in the mistakes, in the ways he hadn't shown up. Journey's eyes had done that. They had peeled back every layer of detachment he had used to protect himself from regret. Back at her school, Journey sat at her desk, sketching in the margins of her notebook. Her classmates buzzed about Shaq's visit, about how big he was, how cool it was that he came to their school. But Journey didn't say much. She kept replaying the moment their eyes locked, the way he looked at her. Not like a celebrity looks at a fan, but like someone remembering something important, like someone seeing someone he thought he'd never see. That night, as Miss Odessa hummed softly in the kitchen, peeling sweet potatoes for Sunday's pie, Journey stood in her room at the window, staring out at the dim street. She held her chalk-dusted fingers against the pane and whispered, "He looked like he knew Daddy." She didn't know why she said it. She just did. And across town, in a house filled with trophies and silence, Shaq opened a box he hadn't touched in years. Inside were clippings from his early mentoring days, photos of kids, letters from parents, handshakes from politicians. At the bottom was a faded photo of him and Jeremiah Whitaker, both smiling, arms slung across shoulders, as if nothing could touch them. He turned the photo over. Written in blue ink, in Shaq's own handwriting, "Protect his future." Shaq closed his eyes. the weight settling fully on him now. He hadn't. But maybe it wasn't too late to start. Sometimes truth hides in broken picture frames and torn Bibles. The flyer looked like any other blurry print, crooked text, stapled to a utility pole that had seen too many elections and lost dogs. It read in big block letters, "Community Donation Drive, furniture needed for elders in need." The address listed at the bottom made Shaq freeze. It was her street, Journey's block, the duplex he'd passed a dozen times and now couldn't stop thinking about. Shaq didn't want to show up as himself, not the towering figure on magazine covers or the public face of endless causes. He needed to blend in, not hide, but listen. And so he loaded the back of a modest rental van with gently used furniture from one of his lesser-known properties. A rocking chair, an end table, a lamp with a cracked base. Things that still worked, things that still had stories. The sun was sharp that morning, already cooking the pavement by the time he pulled up in front of the duplex. The house looked smaller than it did from across the street, older up close, paint peeling in the corners, windows shaded with old curtains, porch creaking under the weight of time. He walked up slowly, cradling the lamp, his steps careful. Before he could knock, the screen door swung open. Miss Odessa stood framed in the doorway, wearing a floral house dress and orthopedic shoes, her silver hair wrapped in a scarf. She didn't smile, but she didn't frown either. Her eyes scanned him quickly, curious, cautious, maybe a little impressed at how a man his size moved so quietly. "You hear about the drive?" she asked, voice low and clear. Shaq nodded. "Got a few pieces in the van. Wanted to drop 'em off if you're still accepting." Odessa stepped aside and gestured with one hand. "Ain't turnin' away blessings. Set 'em near the back room. Floors hold better there." Inside, the house smelled like lemon oil and old books. The air was warm but not uncomfortable. Family photos filled the walls, faces frozen in time, dressed in graduation caps, church clothes, Halloween costumes. The living room was small, the couch threadbare but clean, a quilt folded over the armrest. Shaq placed the lamp gently near a corner. "Nice lamp," Odessa said, eyeing it. "Bet it belonged to somebody who read a lot of dreams under that light." Shaq smiled, not because it was true, but because he wanted it to be. "You local?" she asked as he returned for the other items. "Atlanta mostly. Grew up Jersey side. Travel a lot, trying to stay grounded." Odessa raised an eyebrow, not quite buying it. Most men who say they try to stay grounded, usually just figuring out how to fall without breaking. That landed deeper than it should have. He carried in the last chair and sat it carefully near the back door. Then, as if pulled by something unseen, his eyes fell on a small wooden table beside the hallway entrance. It held a cracked picture frame and a torn Bible with a dozen sticky notes poking out from between worn pages. The photo was faded, two boys in basketball jerseys, arms around each other, smiles crooked and full of light. One of them was unmistakably younger Jeremiah. "You knew him?" Odessa asked behind him, her voice gentle now. Shaq hesitated. "Knew a lot of kids in my time. Some stick with you longer than others." She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Well, he stuck. Didn't go nowhere. Not really. System swallowed him, but that boy never stopped existing, even when they stopped saying his name." Her tone was calm, but Shaq heard the iron underneath. Odessa moved toward the kitchen, motioning him to sit. "You want sweet tea or silence? I got both." "Tea's good," Shaq said, sitting carefully on the couch. She returned with 2 glasses and sat opposite him. The sun filtered in through lace curtains, dust floating in lazy spirals. For a while they just sipped, no rush. Then Odessa leaned forward. "Let me guess, you didn't come to drop off no furniture." Shaq didn't flinch. "That obvious?" "Boy, I seen 17 pastors, 3 census workers, and 1 undercover cop try to blend in on this porch. You're walking like a man trying to pay a debt with kindness." Shaq set his glass down. "I made promises, years ago, to Jeremiah. Said I'd look out for him. Then I got busy. Life got loud. He got buried." Odessa didn't nod or interrupt. She just let the truth hang in the room. "They said he robbed a pawn shop," Shaq continued. "Said the video showed him, but it was grainy. Witnesses conflicted. Lawyer barely showed. I sent one in later, but the damage was done. I didn't go see him. Not once. I thought maybe my name would be more trouble than help." Odessa's voice softened, but her words stayed sharp. "Or maybe you didn't want to see what guilt looks like in a jumpsuit." He looked down, fingers folding into themselves. "I deserved that." "No, baby," she said. He didn't. Silence returned, heavy now. Then Odessa stood and walked to a small cabinet near the hallway. She pulled out a stack of papers, folded letters, court transcripts, A police report with evidence chain disputed, stamped across the bottom. She handed them to Shaq without a word. He sifted through them, heart sinking with every page. The arresting officer had a history of racial profiling. The DA fast-tracked the case to close out fiscal year stats. The public defender had represented 4 other clients that same day. It wasn't just a case of bad luck. It was sabotage dressed as law. "Why didn't you go public?" Shaq asked quietly. "Because it wasn't a movie," Odessa replied. "It was our life. And in real life, black boys don't always get second acts. They get headlines, they get statistics, they get forgot." Shaq stared at the documents, his throat tightening. "She doesn't even know, does she?" "Journey?" Odessa smiled, a kind of bittersweet stretch of her lips. "No, she knows her daddy's away. She don't know he's sitting in a box built by people who never saw his heart. She still prays he'll come home like it's a school project God forgot to grade." Shaq closed the folder. "She deserves better." "She deserves the truth," Odessa said. "But truth is heavy, and she carries enough." Shaq stood slowly, unsure of what to say, of how to fix something so long broken. He walked to the door, but Odessa called after him. "I know who you are," she said. He turned, startled. "I knew when you stepped out that van. Not from the games, not from the news, from the way you looked at that picture like it owed you something." Shaq swallowed. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because this ain't about you being famous. This is about you being faithful. If you're here to be a man of your word, stay. But if you're here to make peace with yourself, drop your donation and go." He didn't move. Odessa gave a slow nod. "Good." Outside, the neighborhood pulsed with life. Kids chasing each other, music bleeding from open windows, a lawnmower growling somewhere nearby. Shaq stepped back into it, different now. He had touched the truth, seen its paperwork, heard its testimony. And in a broken picture frame, beside a torn Bible, he had found the gospel he never expected. Not the one about fame or forgiveness, but the one about accountability and the cost of returning to promises left unpaid. In her closet, she has a wall of unanswered prayers. Until now. The step creaked before it buckled. Shaq felt it the moment his weight pressed down, wood sagging under years of wear, softened by time and weather. His arm shot out against the wall instinctively, steadying himself before his full weight could drive through the panel. Journey, who had just skipped up the last stair ahead of him, turned with a startled glance, her small hand gripping the hallway banister. "You okay?" she asked, a quiet caution in her tone. Shaq nodded, tapping the stair with his boot. "Yeah, but this one's no good." Miss Odessa, hearing the thump from the kitchen, called out with more concern than she let show. "You didn't step on the 3rd riser, did you?" "I told her to warn you. Been soft for months. I keep asking housing to fix it, but we ain't a priority." Journey's face pinched slightly. "I forgot, sorry." "It's all right," Shaq said. "I can fix it." And he meant it. Not just the stair, not just the warped wood, but all of it. Later that afternoon, Odessa pulled out an old toolbox and handed it to him at the top of the stairs with a grateful pat on the arm. "If you can fix that thing without falling through it, you're more useful than any man I've had round here in 20 years. While Odessa prepared lunch downstairs and Journey finished her homework at the coffee table, Shaq knelt at the stairwell, measuring the weak riser and carefully prying off its cracked faceplate. He worked slow and precise, not just because of the care it required, but because of what being in that house made him feel. The closeness, the age in every corner, the layers of memory etched into the furniture, the floors, even the faded paint. This house didn't have much, but it had lived. As he worked, he noticed something strange. Behind the exposed wood, where the stair frame met the drywall, a small gap led to an unfinished space beneath the 2nd floor. And in that crevice, where most would expect wires or insulation, was a small box taped shut, with pastel stickers curling at the corners. It was tucked deep, hidden like a secret. Shaq paused, then gently pulled it free and set it beside him. He didn't open it at first, just stared, sensing he was about to touch something private. After a few moments, he heard a voice behind him. "That's mine." Journey stood at the end of the hallway, her small arms crossed, a crayon still in her hand. She wasn't angry, just protective. She walked forward, her sneakers quiet on the carpet. "That's my prayer box." Shaq met her eyes. "Didn't mean to take it. I didn't know it was there." She looked at the box, then at the gaping stair riser, and back again. Something in her shifted, as if weighing whether to keep guarding the secret or to let it unfold. "You can look," she said, quietly, "if you want." Shaq opened the lid gently. Inside were dozens of small folded papers, most torn from school notebooks, napkins, grocery receipts, anything she could write on. Some were yellowed from age, others still held creases like they'd just been folded yesterday. Each one had a scribbled prayer on it, written in a child's uneven script. Some were short, "Let grandma's knees stop hurting." Others a bit longer, "Don't let mama's sadness win." And a few were so fragile that the ink had faded entirely. But the one that broke him was taped to the underside of the box lid. It was newer, neater, and written with a pink gel pen. "Dear God, bring back Daddy, or send someone better." Shaq didn't speak. Couldn't. He handed the box back to her, gently, as if passing a torch that had never been meant for his hands. She took it but didn't walk away. She sat beside him on the stairwell, quiet. The house had gone still again, just the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the slow tick of the hallway clock, and the sound of his breathing as he tried to hold something broken together. "How long have you been writing these?" he asked, voice raw. She shrugged. "Since I was little."
"You are little."
She smiled at that, the first real one he'd seen from her. I mean, littler. He looked at her, then past her, toward the small door she always kept closed at the end of the hall. "Do you write them every night?" "Not every night," she said. "Only when I feel something too hard to say out loud." That answer sat on his chest like a weight. Shaq stood and followed her as she walked to her room. It was modest. Soft blankets, worn carpet, stickers peeling off a mirror. She knelt in front of the closet and opened it slowly. And there it was. The prayer wall. It wasn't fancy, just one side of the closet covered in taped notes, ribbons, old photos, bits of color and memory stacked one over the other like an emotional collage. Some notes were prayers, others were names. A few were cut-out photos from newspapers, one of which Shaq instantly recognized as the article that had covered Jeremiah's trial years ago. The edges were torn, but the headline remained, "Teen star athlete faces trial in local robbery." Next to it, in pink marker, was a single word written by a child. "Lies." He turned to her. "You made this?" She nodded. Shaq reached up and touched a corner of the newspaper photo, then the note next to it. It read, "God, don't let people forget who he was." It wasn't a shrine. It wasn't fantasy. It was a child's history project that no one had assigned, but one she couldn't let go. A spiritual archive of heartbreak and hope. Shaq stepped back, overwhelmed. "You've got more courage than most people I know." Jornay didn't reply. She just looked up at him and asked, "Did you know my daddy?" He took a breath. "I did," he said. "A long time ago. We played ball. He was kind. He was better than most. He got a raw deal, and I should have done more." She studied him with that same haunting gaze. "Why didn't you?" "I got scared. I got busy. I thought maybe it wasn't my place. But it was. I know that now." She nodded, once, then went back to straightening her notes. He didn't push further, didn't ask for more trust than he'd earned. But something in that moment locked into place. That night, back in his house surrounded by expensive furniture and silence, Shaq couldn't sleep. He stood in his own closet, staring at the empty walls, thinking about hers, about what it means to believe when you have every reason not to. And when the tears came, they weren't loud. They weren't performative. They were quiet, honest, the kind that come from knowing you failed someone who still dares to hope. Shaq picked up his phone. He didn't call his publicist. He didn't write a post. He called Ray. "Set up the visit," he said. And when she asked, "To Ridgeport?" he said yes, it's time. Because a child had written a prayer that offered two options: bring back the man she'd lost or send someone better. Shaq couldn't bring back the past. But maybe, just maybe, he could help rewrite the future. The place where time forgets men is called solitary. There was no sound in Ridgeport Correctional Facility more piercing than the buzz of a security door unlocking. It didn't bang or slam, it hummed, deep and slow like the belly of a machine too old to care who walked through it. Shaq had heard cheers from arenas, whistles from refs, countdown clocks at the final second of a tie game, but none of them sat in his chest like that buzz did. It sounded like resignation, like a gate opening not to welcome, but to warn. He stepped into the administrative wing, led by a lieutenant who barely glanced up from the clipboard he held. They moved in silence past cracked tile floors, rows of fluorescent lights flickering overhead, and guards who looked at Shaq with a mix of curiosity and indifference. He knew the look. Not everyone was excited to see a celebrity in a place built on absence. To them he was just another guy trying to soothe his guilt with gestures. What they didn't know, what he barely admitted to himself, was that this visit wasn't about closure. It was about confession. Shaq had used every ounce of favor he had left to make this happen. Ray had warned him, Jeremiah Whitaker was not in general population. He was in administrative segregation, solitary confinement, where visits were rare and heavily monitored. Not because he was dangerous, but because the system had pushed him so far down its chain of compassion, they no longer saw him as a person, just a number in a jumpsuit. Cell 3C, Tier 4. As they reached the final checkpoint, the lieutenant stopped and turned to him with a nod that lacked warmth. "You'll get 15 minutes. No contact. He hasn't spoken to anyone in months. Don't expect a welcome." Shaq nodded. "I'm not here for that." The door buzzed again. He stepped through. The room was cold and sterile, a booth split by a thick pane of reinforced glass. A metal stool bolted to the floor faced the partition. A phone receiver waited, its cord coiled like a serpent that had seen too many confessions die on its line. Shaq sat, hands folded in front of him, pulse heavier than it should have been. The door on the opposite side opened, and a guard ushered in a man who walked like his bones had given up. Jeremiah Whitaker was leaner now, shoulders rounded, eyes sunken but not vacant. His beard was unkempt, graying at the edges. He moved with the rhythm of someone who measured steps by permission, not instinct. Shaq's throat dried the moment their eyes met. Jeremiah sat without hesitation but didn't touch the phone. He just looked at Shaq, face unreadable as if studying a ghost. The silence between them stretched out long, deep, alive with things unspoken. Shaq picked up the receiver slowly, the old plastic worm from the last set of regrets that passed through it. "Jeremiah," he said softly, "it's me, it's Shaq." Still, the man didn't move. "I owe you everything. I said I'd be there, and I wasn't. I told T-Mac I'd take care of you, and I failed. I let the noise of the world drown out your voice, and I've been carrying that shame every day." He paused, searching Jeremiah's face for a flicker, a shift. "Nothing." "I met your daughter," Shaq continued, voice low. "Journey. She's incredible, smart, strong, looks just like you. She's carrying your name like armor, man, like it's the only thing keeping her from disappearing in this world." Jeremiah's fingers twitched slightly on the tabletop. His gaze sharpened, but still, he said nothing. "I didn't come here for redemption," Shaq said. "I came because she deserves the truth, and you deserve someone who didn't quit on you." At last, Jeremiah leaned forward and picked up the receiver. His knuckles were scarred, not from violence, but from time. He held the phone loosely, then pressed it to his ear. Still no words. Shaq waited. Then Jeremiah reached into the pocket of his prison-issued pants and pulled out a piece of paper, creased, soft, almost falling apart from being unfolded and refolded too many times. He slid it under the glass, letting it rest at the seam between them. Shaq picked it up and carefully unfolded it. It was a baby photo, a girl wrapped in a sunflower print blanket, eyes wide and arms outstretched like she was already reaching for a world that would try to make her small. On the back, a name scrawled in pen, Journey A. Whitaker, and a single line beneath it, "Tell her I never stopped being her father, even when they stopped calling me one." Shaq's hands trembled. Jeremiah finally spoke, voice hoarse, barely more than breath. "Why now?" Shaq blinked. "'Cause she prayed." Jeremiah looked away, eyes trained on a corner of the ceiling where a spiderweb hung like a flag of forgotten places. "They all pray." Shaq leaned in, but this time someone listened. Jeremiah shook his head. "What difference does it make now? I'm in here. She's out there. You showing up don't unmake time." "No," Shaq said, "but it can reshape it. You're not forgotten. She's still writing your story on her walls, still believing you're more than what they called you. You gave her your eyes, man, and she's using them to see the world the way it should be, not the way it is." Jeremiah closed his eyes. "I didn't get a trial, Shaq. I got processed. I know. I've seen the files. The testimony was garbage. The footage didn't even match your height. They knew, but they didn't care." Jeremiah opened his eyes again. "And what now? You gonna go public? Make it a hashtag? Buy my freedom?" Shaq shook his head. "No, I'm not here for a headline. I've hired Ray Delancey. She's building the case from scratch. Quietly, carefully. I'm not going to trade your dignity for my redemption." Jeremiah sat back, the receiver still at his ear, but his posture shifted, less guarded now, tired, but listening. Shaq continued, "I don't want to replace you in her life. I just want to make sure she's not alone while we fight to bring you back." A beat passed. "She still ask about me?" Jeremiah asked, voice nearly gone. Shaq smiled. "Every day. But she don't ask like a victim. She asks like a daughter who knows her father's still breathing." Jeremiah looked away, the weight of those words pressing into his chest. The guard tapped the glass. 2 minutes left. Shaq leaned forward. I know I can't undo what I didn't do, but I can be here now. I can fight with you. For her. Jeremiah didn't reply, but his silence no longer felt like rejection. It felt like the kind of quiet that holds thought, not resistance. The buzzer sounded again. Jeremiah stood slowly, the phone still in his hand. Shaq. Shaq looked up. Don't let her forget my voice. Then he turned and walked out, back into the corridors of iron and fluorescent light, where time keeps its prisoners in silence. Shaq remained seated for a long moment, the photo still in his hands. Behind that glass, something had cracked, not in Jeremiah, but in him. The walls he'd built between his guilt and his action were gone. In their place stood a decision, unshakable now. This wasn't just about a girl's prayer, it was about a man's name, a family waiting to be whole, and a system that would have to answer to someone who no longer cared about how much noise he made. The fight had begun, quietly, intentionally. And it started in the belly of iron, where one voice had refused to die, no matter how long the world had stopped listening. The cost of doing the right thing is never financial. The Ferrari was the first to go. It sat like a trophy in Shaq's private garage, scarlet red, spotless, driven maybe twice a year. It had been a gift to himself after his last ESPN deal, a symbol of speed, power, and arrival, but now it just looked like a monument to the version of him he was trying to bury. The dealership took it without asking why. The Bentley followed a week later. The custom-wrapped Escalade went next. By the time his agent called to ask if everything was all right, Shaq had already wired the money into a new account under the name Journey Legal Defense Fund. The total value of the three vehicles? Just under $1.3 million. The truth was, Shaq didn't miss them. Not the horsepower. Not the envy they stirred. What he needed couldn't be bought. Not with fame, not with a brand, and certainly not with luxury. What he needed was leverage. Legal, strategic, moral. And for that he needed the best. Not the loudest attorneys. Not the ones who ran talk shows or chased clout. He needed professionals with scars. Lawyers who had gone into courtrooms already rigged against their clients and somehow still carved out justice. So he called Ray Delancey again. Ray wasn't interested in media. She never tweeted, never posted her wins. She had come from Mississippi, worked in D.C., then vanished from the spotlight after too many battles against systems designed to outlast you. Shaq had used her name to open doors for others before. This time, he asked her to kick one open for him. I don't want theatrics, Shaq said in their first private meeting at a rented office in downtown Atlanta. I want results. Quiet ones. Thorough. Righteous. Ray didn't blink. Then I'll need full access. Prison transcripts. Case notes. Witness depositions. Every email. Every piece of paper connected to the arrest. I'm going to dig into things you're not going to want to look at. Do it, Shaq said. Whatever it costs. She smiled faintly. It already cost you something. You just don't feel it yet. Word got out within weeks. It wasn't supposed to, but in the age of digital surveillance, nothing stays quiet for long. A junior associate at the courthouse leaked a motion Ray had filed to gain access to sealed evidence. Within hours, gossip blogs were speculating. Shaq involved in prison case. Possible family connection? The headlines snowballed. Talk shows debated whether the former NBA star had a secret child. Political commentators argued over celebrity interference in the justice system. Anonymous accounts flooded the foundation's inbox with messages ranging from passive-aggressive skepticism to outright hate. Another washed-up athlete trying to buy sainthood. Should have stayed on TNT. Nobody cares about some ex-con who got caught. Defending criminals while real families suffer. Shame. The backlash came harder from where he expected it least, within his own philanthropic circles. CEOs and donors who once clinked glasses with him at banquets now sent carefully worded emails expressing concern over public optics. One major sponsor paused a $750,000 commitment. Another threatened to pull out of an upcoming education initiative unless Shaq refocused priorities. He didn't respond to any of them. He stayed off Instagram, deleted Twitter, canceled 2 podcast appearances. He kept showing up to Journey's block quietly. No cameras, no announcements. Sometimes he just stood by the curb, watching the house like he was guarding something sacred. Miss Odessa would offer him tea without asking why. Journey would occasionally sit beside him on the steps, talking about things he didn't understand. Books she liked, classmates she avoided, dreams she didn't tell anyone else. Shaq kept a notebook now, a real one, not in his phone. Handwritten, heavy, dog-eared from use. In it were observations, case notes, questions for Ray, names of old teammates who might remember Jeremiah from his playing days. He began meeting with reform activists, not as a donor, but as a student. He read old legal reviews, transcripts from past wrongful convictions. The system he had once believed could be helped with donations now looked like a machine built to grind boys like Jeremiah down into silence. The more he learned, the quieter he got. And the more he pulled away from the spotlight, the louder the media tried to chase him. The press showed up once outside the duplex. A freelance photographer caught him handing Journey a backpack filled with books and notebooks. The next day, a blurry photo ran under the headline, "Big Shaq's new mystery daughter." Shaq didn't reply. He let the noise pass. He was done feeding the beast. Inside the office Ray had claimed as her command center, documents covered the walls, strings of timelines, mugshots, inconsistencies in the original police narrative. She worked 14-hour days, cross-referencing every move made during the initial trial. She found one especially damning detail. The lead detective in the robbery case had been suspended twice for misconduct, including evidence tampering. "That's our leverage," Ray said, eyes burning. "We reopen the case. We demand a review. This doesn't go to a court of public opinion. This goes to a real court, with facts the judge can't ignore." Shaq nodded. "When?" "Soon, but it's going to get ugly first. They're going to fight back, hard. Nobody wants to admit the system eats innocent black men." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Neither was the silence. He stopped attending foundation dinners, refused to attend a celebrity gala he was set to co-host. His PR rep begged him to put out a statement clarifying the nature of his involvement in the legal case. Shaq told her no. Instead, he visited Ridgeport again. This time, Jeremiah met him with a tighter jaw but less suspicion. They didn't talk about the case. They sat across from each other in silence, letting time pass. Before Shaq left, he placed a copy of the updated legal motion on the table. Jeremiah stared at it. "This don't feel real," he finally said. "It will," Shaq answered. "You just keep breathing. I got the rest." As the days passed, the noise around Shaq began to dim. Not because people forgot, but because he gave them nothing to feed on. No quotes, no videos, no scandal, just silence. And that silence cost him. Endorsements faded. Calls from networks dried up. A small but vocal group began questioning his mental health, his motivations, his legacy. But Shaq didn't flinch. He knew the real price of doing the right thing wasn't money. It was reputation, access, comfort. He could afford to lose all of that. What he couldn't afford was knowing there was a little girl building a wall of prayers in a closet, and a man in a cell clinging to dignity like a lifeline, and choosing to stay comfortable instead of accountable. Then, one evening, after another long day of filings, meetings, and paperwork, Ray handed him a sealed envelope. "This just came in from Ridgeport." Jeremiah wrote it. Shaq opened it slowly. Inside was a single sentence, scribbled in pen that had run out halfway through. "For the first time in years, I don't feel invisible." Shaq sat down, heavy. He didn't cry. Not then, but something inside him softened in a way that money couldn't replicate. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with purpose. And in that stillness, something powerful was being built. Not a case, not a campaign, but a second chance that didn't need a spotlight to matter. Every night she watches stars. One night he watches back. Journey Whitaker had a habit of climbing up on the windowsill after dinner, when the dishes were done and her grandma's gospel radio hummed low in the kitchen. Her window didn't face much, just a narrow street lined with aging porches and crooked mailboxes, but it opened toward the sky. That was what mattered. The sky, no matter where you lived, didn't discriminate. It held stars the same way in a mansion as it did above a broken roof. Most nights she would kneel there quietly, chin resting in her palms, peeking through the old mesh screen. Her eyes moved between the streetlights and the stars, as if reading some kind of code the rest of the world had forgotten. Miss Odessa would sometimes scold her gently, saying too much time at the window invited restlessness, but Journey would only nod and keep watching. It wasn't rebellion, it was ritual. That's where Shaq first noticed her the second time he returned. Not as a silent guardian parked across the street, but as a presence stepping carefully onto their porch with a bag of groceries in hand. Odessa raised an eyebrow when she saw him again, this time in sweatpants and an old hoodie, the air of a man not trying to impress anyone. "You back for another donation?" she asked, arms crossed, one brow arched. "I brought real food this time," Shaq said. "You fed me tea and truth. Least I could do was return the favor." She paused just long enough to make him sweat, then held the door open. "Well, if you brought greens and cornbread, I might let you pray over the meal." The moment he stepped inside, he glanced up and caught her, Journey on the sill, watching the sky again, arms folded tight, expression distant. She didn't react to seeing him. She didn't wave. But her gaze lingered a little longer before she turned away. Over the next few weeks, Shaq came more often. He didn't arrive with announcements or noise. No entourage, no foundation photographers. Just him, with a duffel bag of snacks, notebooks, sometimes a book or two. The first time he offered to help with homework, Journey looked at him like he was joking. But when he gently corrected a math mistake and showed her a simpler way to break down word problems, she softened, just slightly. Her eyes didn't narrow as much. Her shoulders dropped. She wasn't quick to speak, but she listened closely. And when he handed her a small leather-bound journal one afternoon, telling her it was for thoughts too big to carry around in your chest, she took it without a word and tucked it under her pillow. By the next visit, 3 pages were filled with poetry. Her writing was raw and bright, and heartbreaking. Lines like, "Some days, silence makes more sense than questions, and I don't know if God hears girls from broken porches." Shaq read them with a stillness he hadn't known he had. Each verse held the weight of someone twice her age, and yet every word belonged to her. "You ever think about showing people this?" he asked one afternoon, gently. "No point," she replied. "People like me don't get published. We just pray someone keeps the power on." He didn't argue. He just said, "That's what people thought about me too." She looked at him differently after that. In time, she asked more questions. Where he grew up, what his mom was like, if he was always that tall, if he ever got scared before big games. He answered everyone honestly, sometimes with humor, sometimes with heaviness. He never played up his fame. In fact, he made fun of it, telling her how once he got stuck in a hotel bathroom because the doorframe was too narrow. That made her laugh, really laugh, with her whole face, and after that something unlocked. But one question kept circling her lips, never quite making the full leap until one cool evening, when the windows were open and the air carried the smell of damp leaves. "Do you know my dad?" she asked suddenly, not looking at him, just tracing a finger along the edge of her notebook. Shaq paused, the breath catching in his throat. He had practiced the moment in his mind, imagined what he'd say. He knew the facts. He had the picture. He had stood face to face with the man. But in that instant, with her voice so soft and her question so real, the truth didn't feel like something you could drop like a fact. It felt like a glass you had to hand over with care. "I'm trying to," he said finally. "I'm trying real hard." She nodded slowly, as if she knew that answer already. Later that night, after Odessa had gone to bed and Shaq had packed up his things to leave, he lingered on the sidewalk outside the house. The porch light flickered twice, like always. From the corner of his eye, he caught the shadow shift in the upstairs window. She was there, watching again. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just looked up, this time not at the stars but at her, and she looked back. It was only a second, a moment, but it held more than any press conference he'd ever given. In that silence, they were 2 people linked not by blood, not by title, but by a promise unspoken, that someone was listening, that she wasn't alone. From that night on, it became routine. Every time he left, she'd be there at the window. Some nights she waved, some nights she just watched, and some nights he found himself staring at the sky from his own window back home, wondering how a child's quiet gaze had reshaped everything he believed about himself. Journey never said she forgave him. She hadn't needed to. He hadn't asked. But she let him stay. And that, more than any applause, any headline, any honor, was enough. Not everyone wants the truth. Some prefer it buried. It came in a plain white envelope. No return address, no stamp. Just hand-delivered and left on the front desk at the Department of Family and Children's Services in Fulton County. Inside were 2 typed pages, anonymous, but sharply worded, laced with passive urgency. The child in question, Journey Whitaker, is in the care of a woman far too old and physically impaired to meet state guardianship standards. And later, more pointed, the environment appears unsafe and possibly manipulated by outside influence, including a celebrity figure with unclear ties to the child's family. It read like a complaint, but underneath it was a threat, and it hit the system where it always took notice: liability. By the end of that day, a formal inquiry had been opened. Journey's case file, which had long rested quietly under the weight of bureaucracy, was suddenly back in motion. New eyes, new questions, new risk. Shaq found out the next morning, not through the press or his lawyer, but through Miss Odessa herself. She called while he was on his way to a school literacy event, her voice calm, but her words clipped. "They sent a woman to the house this morning," she said. "Said she was just checking in, but I've been through enough to know when someone ain't just checking. She was looking for reasons." Shaq pulled his SUV over in the middle of a residential street, hands clenched on the wheel. "Did she say anything about removing Journey?" "No. but she kept taking notes on things that didn't need noting, like whether the heater worked, or if I had a medical device in the house. Asked too many times if there were stairs Journey had to climb on her own. And she looked at your photograph when she saw it on the mantel. Didn't say your name, but I could see it in her eyes. She knew. Shaq's jaw tightened. He hung up, called Ray, and by the time she answered, his voice had already shifted into a register she hadn't heard from him before. "They're coming for her," he said. "Who's they?" Ray asked, already moving through files on her laptop. "The same people who never liked the idea of a black girl having hope. The ones who smile in courtrooms while making sure nobody notices who's not in the room." Ray didn't argue. "I'll file for a protective review order today. But if someone's stirring up child services, they're not playing fair. This isn't about the girl. It's about discrediting the environment around her, starting with Odessa. We need to act fast." It got worse that afternoon. Another envelope. This time it arrived at the administrative office of the Shaquille O'Neal Foundation. A staffer opened it and froze. Inside were printed screenshots of visitation logs from Ridgeport Correctional Facility, records that had been legally sealed under privacy orders. Along with them was a brief message in block letters. How far will the media let this go, before they ask why a millionaire is sneaking into prisons to visit convicted felons? By the time Shaq was back at his office, 3 more emails had come in, 2 from sponsors, 1 from a PR consultant. All said the same thing in different tones. Explain. Soon. Ray called within the hour. "They're using Journey as leverage. This is retaliation. They're warning you back off Jeremiah's case, or they'll bring the whole thing down." Shaq didn't flinch. Let them try. But the weight of it settled deep, because this wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't him fighting an old guilt, or seeking redemption in the eyes of a child. This was the system, sharp and calculating, doing what it always had, defending itself. And it didn't matter how famous he was. It didn't matter how right the cause was. All that mattered was control. That night, Shaq didn't sleep. He sat at the end of the long hallway in his house, staring at the photo of Journey on his phone. It was the one he'd taken quietly weeks ago. She was sitting on the porch, drawing chalk angels again, her brows furrowed like she was correcting heaven itself. He tapped the screen, held her image there. Then he picked up his notebook. He wrote names. He wrote threats. He wrote 2 words in all caps. "Not again." The next morning, he drove straight to Miss Odessa's house. No hoodie, no attempt to blend in. He came dressed in a suit, tailored, gray, sharp as if entering a courtroom instead of a living room. Journey was on the couch reading. Odessa was already at the table with 2 cups of coffee and a look that said something's coming. Shaq spoke directly. "We need to fight this." Odessa didn't blink. Already figured that. Journey looked between them. "What's happening?" Shaq knelt beside her. "There are people who don't want me helping your daddy. People who think your grandma can't take care of you. They're wrong. But they're trying to make it look like they're right." Journey frowned, clutching the armrest. "Are they gonna take me?" "No," Shaq said firmly. "Not if I have anything to do with it." She studied his face. "You're not just saying that?" "I don't say things I can't back up," he said. She nodded once. And with that, the bond between them sealed tighter. Over the next 48 hours, Ray filed 2 emergency motions, one to block any further custody review without an independent evaluator, and another to file injunctions against the unauthorized leak of the sealed visitation records. She demanded a full audit of how those files were accessed and by whom. At the same time, Shaq met with members of the press, not for interviews, but off-record sit-downs. He presented the full context, the injustice, the case history, Journey's potential removal, and he said one thing clearly: "You can print what you want, but know this: if you attack that child, you're not reporting, you're participating." The shift was slow, but it started. Some journalists backed off. A few even started digging on their own, questioning the legitimacy of the complaint against Odessa. One outlet uncovered a pattern: 5 similar complaints filed in the last 6 months against families tied to criminal justice reform advocates. All anonymous, all conveniently timed. The dots started connecting. Still, the clock was ticking. Shaq received word from Ray that Child Services had scheduled a formal evaluation in 3 days. If they didn't halt it legally by then, Journey could be temporarily removed for safety observation. The night before the hearing, Shaq returned to the duplex. He sat on the porch, watching the stars rise, waiting for her to appear at the window. When she did, she didn't wave. She just looked at him. And this time, he spoke softly, but with certainty. "You stay ready, okay? Whatever happens, I'm not leaving. I'm not letting them write this ending." She didn't say anything, just nodded once and pulled the curtain back gently. Inside, Miss Odessa packed a folder full of medical documents, school reports, handwritten notes from teachers, and one photo of her, Jeremiah, and baby Journey in a hospital room before everything went wrong. Shaq stood behind her, silent, reverent. "You sure you want to put your name behind this?" she asked without turning. "I'm not putting my name," he replied. "I'm putting my life." Because now it wasn't just about fixing an old mistake. It was about protecting the one thing no system could quantify: hope. And someone was trying to steal it. Not on his watch. Some trials don't happen in courtrooms, they happen in the heart. The courthouse didn't look like justice. It looked like paperwork. Beige walls, metal detectors that beeped for no reason, long hallways that smelled like overcooked coffee and stress. The benches were worn down smooth, the kind of wood that had carried decades of people waiting on decisions that would shape or shatter their lives. Shaq arrived early. He wore no suit this time. Just a pressed black shirt, slacks and shoes that didn't squeak when he walked. No jewelry. No foundation pins. He looked like a man coming not to represent a cause, but to own a consequence. Ray was already there, seated in the far corner of the waiting area, her bag open, files spread out like a general preparing for battle. She didn't look up until he sat beside her. "Today's going to be hard," she said, eyes still scanning documents. "We got 2 hearings. The resentencing petition for Jeremiah, and then custody review for Journey. They're going to try to use one against the other, tie them together like a noose." Shaq exhaled. "Let them try." She glanced at him. "You ready to go public? All the way?" "I've been silent long enough." Inside the courtroom, the first hearing was already drawing interest. Journalists whispered quietly from the back row. A few lawyers from other cases stood by the doors, sensing this was one of those rare moments where the system might actually be forced to look at itself. The presiding judge was a seasoned man in his 60s, gravel in his voice, steel in his posture. Judge Hank McMillan had overseen everything from gang cases to white-collar fraud, but today he seemed more alert than usual. Ray noted it immediately. "Your Honor," she began once they were called forward, "we are submitting a motion for resentencing based on new evidence, procedural negligence, and verified misconduct in the original trial of Jeremiah Whitaker." The judge adjusted his glasses. "On what grounds?" "Suppressed exculpatory evidence, compromised testimony, and tampered footage. Also, the lead detective in the original case has since been dismissed for falsifying arrest records in 2 other convictions, one of which was overturned." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And why now?" Before Ray could answer, Shaq stepped forward. "Because I failed," he said. His voice didn't need a mic. It wasn't loud, but it was full. The judge studied him. "Mr. O'Neill, this court is aware of your name. Why are you speaking today?" Shaq didn't flinch.
"Because I mentored Jeremiah when he was 17. I watched him get arrested. I watched his name get dragged through the news. I watched the system chew him up. And then I left. I let him fade into the background of my success."
Gasps. Not dramatic ones, but small, surprised exhalations from the gallery. Even Ray turned slightly, though she already knew. "I've spent years building foundations, hosting galas, cutting ribbons, but I've never done what I came here today to do. Stand up in a space like this, and say that I let the system rob a kid I promised to protect. And that silence was mine, not the media's, not the court's, mine." Judge McMillan let the silence linger before responding. "That's a powerful statement. But this is still a legal process." "It is," Ray said, stepping forward again. "And legally the case fails the test of integrity. But morally, you've just heard it. We don't need a miracle. We need accountability." The judge read through the submitted files. It was clear he'd seen enough cases to know when something stank. This one reeked. He called a short recess. The room buzzed. When they returned, his verdict came measured, deliberate. "This court finds grounds to vacate the original sentence and grant a resentencing hearing within 30 days. Mr. Whitaker will be transferred out of solitary pending review." This is not an exoneration yet, but it is a reckoning. A murmur swept through the room. Ray nodded subtly. Shaq exhaled slowly, eyes closing just for a second, but there was no time to savor it. The second hearing was next. Journey's case. They moved to another courtroom, smaller, colder somehow. A different judge, this one younger, sharper, with a prosecutor's precision behind his eyes. The child services representative was already seated, files stacked high. Odessa sat calmly beside Shaq, her cane resting across her lap. Journey sat between them, small and steady, clutching her notebook like armor. The social worker began. We are petitioning for temporary removal of Journey Whitaker from her current residence, pending evaluation of her guardian's physical ability to meet her needs, and due to increased media presence and involvement by outside entities, which may compromise her emotional safety. Ray rose. Your Honor, what they are calling outside influence is actually support protection. Journey is thriving in school. She's emotionally stable. Her grandmother has kept her safe for years. There's no incident, no injury, no neglect, just suspicion. Manufactured, strategized. The judge looked at Odessa. Miss Whitaker, do you wish to say anything before I rule? Odessa nodded and stood slowly, the room stilling as she adjusted her stance. Then, with the weight of history in her bones, she spoke. I raised 3 children on a salary that couldn't buy me bus fare by the end of the week. I watched my oldest son get taken away in handcuffs when he should have been walking into a college gym. I didn't stop fighting then, and I won't stop now. My knees may be tired, Your Honor, but my spirit isn't. I may walk with a cane, but don't confuse that with weakness. I've loved this child with everything I had when nobody else showed up, and now when she's finally getting something close to a real chance, the system wants to take her again. She pointed toward Journey, who sat still, eyes wide. She writes poems about stars and broken things. She still believes in God, even when she don't understand him. She don't need removal. She needs restoration. The judge sat back, measured, unreadable. Then he looked at Shaq. You've become a part of her life. What's your role? Shaq stood. I'm not her father. I won't pretend I am. But I promised her father I'd protect her. I broke that promise once. I won't do it again. The judge tapped his gavel once. Motion to remove is denied. Custody remains with Miss Odessa Whitaker. The court will assign a neutral evaluator to monitor conditions, but no changes will be made unless new evidence arises. The courtroom exhaled. Journey's grip on her notebook loosened. Shaq placed a hand on Odessa's shoulder. Ray smiled softly and began gathering her notes. They had won, not completely, not forever, but enough for today. Outside, reporters clustered near the steps. Ray blocked most of them, ushering the family into a waiting car. But one question pierced the noise. Mr. O'Neill, is this about legacy? Shaq paused just long enough to look the reporter in the eye.
No, he said. This is about repair.
Then he turned to Odessa, who was already helping Journey into the car. And with that, the day ended. Not in applause, not in headlines, but in something rarer. Dignity. The prayer started under a streetlight. It ended with a sunrise. The morning he was released, the sun hadn't broken the horizon yet. Ridgeport stood hushed in the blue haze of dawn, still and cold, as if the very air was waiting for confirmation that something impossible was about to happen. The chain-link fences gleamed with frost. The yard lights buzzed softly overhead. Inside, Jeremiah Whitaker stood facing a mirror that had warped from years of moisture, running his hand across the chin he hadn't seen clean-shaven in over a decade. The barber had come in early, not for protocol, but because Jeremiah had asked quietly, respectfully, to leave without the beard that had hidden his face from himself. By 6:00 a.m., the paperwork was signed. The cell door clicked open and stayed that way. No announcement. No farewell. Just a corridor that didn't lock behind him anymore. Ray was waiting in the car outside. Shaq was beside her, wearing a gray hoodie and a quiet stare that held everything they hadn't said yet. Jeremiah stepped into the open air, a single canvas duffel over his shoulder, his release shoes too stiff, his breath tight in his chest. For a man who hadn't been in sunlight without chains since he was 19, the sky felt too big to look at directly, so he looked at them instead. He didn't smile, but he nodded. Shaq stepped forward and opened the door himself. You ready? Jeremiah didn't answer, just climbed in. The drive back was quiet, not tense, just full. There was too much in the air to force words. Atlanta rolled past the windows slowly, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Buildings taller than Jeremiah remembered. Murals on brick walls that hadn't been there. Street corners that used to mean danger now glowing with boutique cafes. And still some things hadn't changed. The way police cruisers lingered too long at red lights. The way people on sidewalks walked with their shoulders drawn in. The way you could still tell who had to fight for their joy. They stopped at a small diner outside the city. One Ray trusted. Owned by an older black couple who served breakfast with quiet dignity and no cell phone photos. Jeremiah sat across from Shaq in a booth near the back, the smell of coffee and bacon clinging to the corners of the room. You got any idea what comes next? Shaq asked. Jeremiah didn't answer at first. He stirred his coffee, took a bite of toast, then looked up, eyes steady. You do what you said you'd do, and I learn how to live free. Shaq nodded, holding his gaze. You're not alone this time. Later that afternoon, they pulled up in front of the duplex. The yard had been mowed. The porch rails had been replaced. Small wind chimes danced in the breeze, ringing like tiny bells of welcome. Odessa stood at the top of the steps, one hand clutching the doorframe for balance. Journey was just behind her, half hidden, her small fingers curled around the screen door's edge. Jeremiah stepped out slowly. No crowd, no news vans, no grand gesture, just family. He walked up the steps with a kind of weight that didn't come from fear. It came from time, from loss, from memory. Odessa opened her arms without words. They held each other like people who had both stayed loyal in separate prisons. When they broke apart, her hand stayed on his chest just a second longer. Then she stepped aside. Journey stood there, frozen. Her eyes filled but didn't fall. He knelt. "Hey baby," he said. She walked into his arms without a sound. Shaq stood at the sidewalk, not moving forward, not inserting himself, just there, like he'd promised. Inside, the house felt different, like something old had been lifted. Jeremiah sat in his father's chair, which had never been his before. Journey brought him the prayer box, carefully like an offering, and he opened it with reverence. They read the notes together, one by one. When they reached the last one, the one she'd written the night before, he had to stand and walk to the kitchen window just to breathe. Outside, the sky was streaked with orange now, the day moving gently into its next chapter. There was no parade, no headline. The media, having lost interest once the controversy faded, stayed silent. A few blogs mentioned it. One outlet ran a short paragraph. In a rare post-conviction ruling, Jeremiah Whitaker walked free today after 15 years of wrongful incarceration. His case was aided by civil rights attorneys and supported privately by Shaquille O'Neal. But the streets didn't forget. Neighbors noticed the porch light on late again, and the third chair added to the steps. Journey's teacher sent home a note saying she'd read her first poem aloud in class, a piece called "Things That Wait But Don't Give Up." Miss Odessa started singing while cooking again, and every few days Shaq stopped by, not to check in, not to supervise, but to sit on the porch and let time unfold beside the people who taught him what showing up really meant. One Saturday, while Jeremiah and Odessa worked on repairing the back fence, Shaq sat with Journey at the kitchen table. She was writing, head down, focused. He watched her for a moment before asking, "What's this one about?" She looked up. "You'll see." A few minutes later, she closed the notebook and walked to her room. Shaq stood, unsure whether to follow, but then she reappeared holding a small worn paper. She handed it to him. It was a note, carefully written in bold black ink, taped now to the top corner of her prayer wall. "Dear God, thank you. I got them both." Shaq blinked, looked at her, and felt something unshakable settle in his chest. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. That night he walked home under a sky full of stars, the same kind she'd watched from that windowsill all those weeks ago. But now he didn't look up searching for something to guide him. He walked with his eyes forward, finally understanding what it meant to answer a prayer that wasn't yours, to stand in the gap, to become part of someone's story without trying to control it. He knew his name would fade from this part of town eventually. The foundations would keep running, the media would shift focus, but the porch light would always be on. And somewhere inside that house, a girl who believed the world could still hear her whisper had been proven right. Because the prayer that started under a flickering streetlight didn't just reach God. It reached a man who had spent his whole life being seen, and yet finally learned what it meant to see back. And in the corner of a closet lined with tape and truth, one final note stayed untouched. A seal of everything that had changed, not with noise, but with love. "Dear God, thank you. I got them both." If this story stirred something in you, don't just sit with it, stand in it. Look around your block, your school, your city. Someone's prayer is waiting to be heard. Be the answer no one expects, but everyone needs. Because healing isn't a headline. It's what we choose to show up for when the cameras are gone. The question isn't who will help, it's who will hear.